It's been a few years, but I still don't think I've recovered from Avengers Endgame, and that's really saying something given we're knee-deep into Phase 4 content at this point. But there was something about that perfect culmination of all our heroes banding together to defeat Thanos once and for all that just still makes me want to cheer. But Endgame changed a lot of things, especially the earlier films in the franchise. That's right, the MCU has always had awesome individual moments, but which of them truly hit harder after seeing Endgame? Well, look at that, we got a whole list of them right here, so let's get started right now. Everything was different after the Battle of New York. Not only did rent and insurance prices probably go up after aliens dropped from the sky, but this battle completely changed Tony Stark. The whole theme of Iron Man 3 was how Tony suffered severe PTSD after seeing beyond the wormhole. He knew now that there were forces bigger than anything they imagined, and it was only a matter of time before a huge threat came to Earth, and they had to be prepared. This led to panic attacks and Tony saying that he couldn't sleep. The not sleeping part is a huge aspect here because although there's a lot going on in Iron Man 3, Tony's insomnia, which represents his fear of not protecting the world properly, comes into play at the very end of Endgame. After Tony makes his big sacrifice and is so hurt that he can't even quip, which was the clear indicator that he would not be walking away from this, he gets one final goodbye with his loved ones. First Peter and then with Pepper. Both of these goodbyes made me a big puddle of sadness on the movie theater floor, but Pepper's final words to Tony made me immediately expunge Niagara Falls levels of tears. As he fades away, she tells Tony that they're going to be okay and that Tony can rest now. After seeing this scene, you can go back through everything post 2012 Avengers and realize how frantic and scared Tony was about saving the Earth from someone like Thanos. It's why he created Ultron and continued to invent new suits and new technology without much downtime. And in the end, it was all okay. Tony's hard work paid off, and even though some of his actions were questionable, he ended up saving the entire universe from destruction. Yes, he can definitely rest now. Every team has some growing pains. This was especially true of the Avengers. In their first big team-up movie, it took some time for the heroes to warm up to each other, especially Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. Their most famous argument led to one of the most quotable lines in the entire franchise, with Tony calling himself a genius billionaire playboy philanthropist after Steve asks him what he was without his suit of armor. It was in this fight that Steve called Tony out for never being the guy to make the sacrifice play, to never be the guy to lay down on the wire so someone else could crawl over him. Now, this statement is technically debunked at the end of that very movie, with Tony taking the missile up to space to blow up the alien ships, and it's pretty clear that he doesn't think he's coming back. But of course, this was only the first Avengers movie, and Iron Man was the most popular character, so of course they weren't gonna off him in this movie. He was fine in the end, but him living to fight another day didn't necessarily prove Steve wrong, but rather suggested that in a certain situation that yes, Tony would sacrifice himself. Fast forward to Endgame and it finally happened. Seeing Tony slowly realize that this was the one possible future that Doctor Strange saw where they win, and accepting that he had to sacrifice himself in order to win was heartbreaking. Sure, I mean, maybe you could argue Strange holding up the one finger was actually Strange saying, 1 second while I finish up with this flood dilemma and then I'll use a sling ring to slice Thanos' arm off, no problem, but I guess now we'll never know. Anyway, going back to watch the Avengers and hearing about the sacrifice play definitely hits harder now. I think Steve Rogers definitely got better in the MCU as time went on, but also sorta generally more tragic. He escaped the "ah shucks, I'm an old guy in present time" that was prevalent in the early Avengers movies, to someone relatively lonely in life who would always strive to do the right thing in his solo movies. That sense of loss the character felt is perfectly encapsulated in the first solo movie when he wakes up in the present day and tells Nick Fury that he had a date. We know from his final phone call with Peggy that the date was for them to go dancing together, and wowza! Rewatching that goodbye scene, plus the waking up scene, definitely hits harder now. Mainly because it goes from a tragic and doomed love story to one of genuine happiness, because you know that one day, Steve is going to break all the rules of time traveling, finally think about himself for once, and after a quick detour of returning all the stones, he'll choose to reunite with Peggy in the past. You know, I'm not normally one for undercutting truly dramatic moments by undoing them later, but I think this is one of those rare instances that works. after giving everything to the mission and to the world, Steve finally thought about himself for once and chose to be with his one true love. So if you ever go back and watch the first Avenger, don't be sad that these two crazy kids are about to be separated by 80 years, but rather rejoice that they'll eventually be reunited. But do that without thinking of all the complicated time travel questions and problems that arise with Steve going back in time and eventually coming back meeting Sam in his old age. That's a whole other can of worms. I think a truly underrated moment that hits harder after Avengers Endgame deals with the conversation Bruce Banner has with Tony Stark in the first Avengers movie. In those early scenes, Tony frankly has a dangerous mindset in regards to Bruce, where while floating up in the sky with a bunch of people, Tony pokes and prods Bruce just to kind of, see what would happen. I think Cap has every right to get mad at Tony here, but the real meat of their time together comes when Bruce is talking like he's basically cursed, but Tony suggests that because all that gamma radiation should have wiped Bruce out forever but didn't, that there was some greater purpose to it all.
Saved it for what?
I guess we'll find out.
Bruce is of course a little skeptical about this, but flash forward to Endgame where because the stones and the makeshift gauntlet they build deal with gamma radiation, that Professor Hulk is the only one around who could handle all that sweet Infinity Gauntlet power to snap everyone back and still live. I think it paints that OG Avengers scene completely differently in basically foreshadowing that Hulk and Bruce have some greater purpose in the MCU that had yet to reveal itself, and Endgame was it. It sorta makes it feel like the Hulk's character arc in the MCU had some greater purpose rather than all the mismanagement we've gotten since his debut. Yes, I've been talking about the Hulk's ruined character arc a lot recently. I mean, there's a whole video where I basically explain how they ruined Hulk's character, but I'm not salty or anything. Anyways, this scene makes that whole ordeal just a bit better. The MCU's Peter Parker is like a puppy dog that was granted sentience from Agatha Harkness. He's like a snickerdoodle that Loki enchanted to come to life and feel anxiety all the time. He's like that moment when Professor Hulk gave Ant-Man a taco in human form. There's a lot to love about the lovable Peter Parker, and one of his defining traits so far is his relationship with his mentor, Tony Stark. Of course, any teenager would be thrilled at not only meeting Tony Stark, but being recruited to go fight the other Avengers in another country. At least, I think they would. Anyway, their relationship is a major backbone of the series in later movies, and there's one moment that appears to just be a comical throwaway in Homecoming that holds much more meaning after Endgame. In Homecoming, while in the back of Tony's car, Peter thinks Tony is going in for a hug, but is actually just opening the door so Peter would leave, telling him they're not there yet. Flash forward to Endgame, where after the thought of rescuing Peter after feeling responsible for his dusting causes Tony to invent time travel and stop Thanos, the two are reunited amongst the ruins of the Avengers compound. Peter comes up to Tony and starts freaking out because basically no time has passed at all for him. But it's been a long 5 years for Tony, and it culminates in him finally hugging Peter. It makes that Homecoming scene even better. Of course, I have to include the moment that really started and ended it all. I think the MCU officially kicked into high gear as soon as Tony ended his first movie with the famous "I am Iron Man" line. But who would have expected that line to take on a whole new meaning after Endgame? Those turn out to be Tony's last words in the MCU, as Thanos sets him up perfectly with his whole "I am inevitable" line. To me, Tony's repetition of "I am Iron Man" is such a great start and end point for Phase 1 and Phase 3. The first time he says it's opening up a whole new world, and over the next decade, we'd see Tony become one of Earth's greatest defenders with a few minor missteps along the way. Then his final time saying it is a declaration of everything he stood for up until that point. He is Iron Man, you know? One of Tony's big running themes in those early movies is how he never got proper closure with his father. Of course, we all know the Winter Soldier took Tony's parents away from him when he was 21, but Tony finally got to have a final conversation with Howard in Endgame. It's a cathartic moment for Tony, one that I think helps prepare him to sacrifice himself by the end of the movie as he realizes what's important in life. And here's the thing, I think this scene makes Iron Man 2 better. It's safe to say that Iron Man 2 is on the lower end of MCU movies due to a plethora of problems, but a core theme is Tony's relationship with his father. Knowing that the genius billionaire playboy philanthropist will get some actual closure to that father and son relationship in Endgame makes that subplot of Iron Man 2 carry more weight. The only thing that would have made the Endgame scene better is if Tony had a chance to ask his dad why he went through such elaborate and painstaking methods to hide the creation of the new element, but that's just a tiny nitpick. The best scene in Avengers Age of Ultron is hands down the after-party scene where all the Avengers just hang out and try to lift Thor's hammer. But like all these entries, this scene has now been reanalyzed after Endgame. The final battle against Thanos sees Cap lift Mjolnir in one of the most satisfying moments in the entire franchise. But the question has become, did Cap fake being able to lift the hammer in Age of Ultron? It's tough to say. You can really see both sides. The original scene shows the hammer move a little bit, but then Steve gives up rather easily, saying he can't do it. That sparked a lot of debate about how if a person can be sort of worthy, but not quite, because doesn't it feel like an all or nothing thing? The theory is that Cap knew he could lift it, but didn't out of respect for Thor. But then the other theory is that Cap wasn't quite worthy yet because he was keeping the secret about Bucky's involvement with Tony's parents' demise, and that was weighing on him, which does make sense. But whatever the truth is, seeing Cap lift the hammer in Endgame makes you want to go back and try to read Cap's facial expression in Age of Ultron to see if he's lying or not. What do you think? If you go back and rewatch Spider-Man Homecoming, does anyone else awkwardly cough and grimace during Tony and Peter's big confrontation after the boat scene? While Tony berates Peter for being irresponsible, he tells him, "If you died, I feel like that's on me." It does seem like if anything happens to Peter that Tony would feel responsible. I mean, again, he technically would be since Peter is a 15-year-old who was recruited to fight the Avengers. And Endgame shows us that this isn't all talk. It seems like after Tony makes it back to Earth and confirms that Pepper is alright, the next biggest thing that Tony is truly shaken by is how he lost Peter and couldn't save him. Seeing Tony's trauma and grief in Endgame makes his homecoming speech that much more impactful, because we know now exactly how Tony would react if Peter bit the dust. I'm actually surprised Tony didn't name his daughter Parker or like Peterella even. Did anyone else go to their nearest burger establishment after Endgame and consume their weight in cheeseburgers? Oh, just me? Okay then. But Endgame overall did a great job in providing previous moments with a bit of narrative heft. Take the whole cheeseburger thing for instance. In Iron Man, when Tony first comes back, he asks for a cheeseburger before his press conference. It's a funny moment and parallels the real-life experience of Robert Downey Jr., who famously, after eating a tremendously bad Burger King meal, realized he hit rock bottom and needed help. But then Endgame turns that moment into one that will tug at your heartstrings after Tony's daughter asks for a cheeseburger, and Happy gets choked up. Thanks, MCU, for turning a funny moment into a bittersweet, emotional one. Excuse me, I gotta go eat more cheeseburgers. I don't think Rocket's story is highlighted enough in Endgame. Yeah, there's a lot going on, but I would have liked to see how Rocket was handling the loss of his makeshift family after everything he went through in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Endgame makes the ending of that movie even more sad, as when Rocket sees that all the Ravagers showed up for Yondu's funeral, it helps him realize that people like Yondu and Rocket won't push all their loved ones away. Rocket, at this moment, fully comes to love and trust these people, which makes it all the more brutal that literally all of them are snapped away except for Nebula. I really hope the upcoming third movie doesn't shy away from exploring how Rocket processed his grief during that 5-year period, because it has the potential to be a great subplot. Black Widow had a complicated past that we didn't quite see a whole lot of before Endgame. But from everything Natasha told us, it was a history that haunted her relentlessly. Sure, the Natasha we met was a full-on hero, but there's a whole section of her life that we didn't see where she was a top Russian assassin. This led her to believing she had a ton of red in her ledger, and everything she did was to try to wipe that slate clean. This brings us to Endgame, where she launched herself off that Vormir cliff not only to save her best friend Hawkeye's life, but also allowed the Avengers to get the Soul Stone and bring everyone back. She sacrificed herself for the entire universe, and if that doesn't wipe the slate clean and clear her of all her past crimes, I don't know what does. But hearing early MCU Natasha talk about how she has red in her ledger and how she views herself as a monster is tragic, once knowing she'll go on to do everything she ends up doing. I've been talking about some really heavy stuff in this video, so I wanted to end with a bit of a lighter entry to help move away from all the demise, destruction, sadness, and overall gloom that a lot of these entries talked about. So that's where Ant-Man comes in. Yep, good old Scott Lang, always around to lighten the mood when we need him the most. Anyways, I actually want to talk about Cassie Lang, Scott's daughter. Now, in the first 2 Ant-Man movies, Cassie was just a little kid who said cute kid things. But one moment stands out. It's when she floats the idea of Scott having a partner, and she's clearly talking about herself. Obviously, she's too young to fight crime, but after Endgame, this scene plays completely differently. Now that Cassie is 5 years older and knowing how dedicated she was to becoming a superhero at a young age, it's pretty apparent she'll follow in her father's footsteps in the upcoming 3rd Ant-Man movie. I mean, they recast Cassie with serious up-and-comer Catherine Newton for Quantumania, so you know Cassie's about to start taking her superheroing seriously. It shows how those 5 years were bad, but it also set up a bunch of new heroes in the MCU. You know, with the introduction of the Eternals and Eros, I wonder if in a few years we're going to look back over Endgame differently, specifically in terms of Thanos. I have a feeling his backstory is about to get fleshed out even more, and I wonder if that will change how we view the character overall. Only time will tell, I guess.